It's great to be here, in part, as he was saying, with this multi-sectoral group of people, of governments, of civil society, and others, which very much reflects what the Global Partnership to End Violence is also trying to do. It's about bringing together that multi-sectoral dimension to end violence against children, with that recognition that the only way we are going to succeed in ending violence against children is if we do it together. I've had the pleasure of working with Andrew for many years now, since the early 2000s, both on child protection systems, and also with children's participation. And I have to say, watching this presentation this morning and meeting some of the young people earlier, it's great to see the work that they are doing here. And I was asked to come and speak a little bit about what's happening on the global scale, to see where there are some similarities and some lessons that we can all share with each other, and to let you know what some of the things that we're doing at the Global Partnership to End Violence are. As mentioned, I've been seconded to the partnership since November of last year, and we officially launched in July of 2016 by the then Secretary General as a mechanism for governments to come together to achieve some of the Sustainable Development Goals. We bring together civil society, children and young people, the private sector, foundations, governments, anybody who wants to be part of the solutions to ending violence against children. We're housed out of UNICEF in New York, and are always very thankful to our UNICEF colleagues for giving us a roof and support in terms of both our director, but also a number of the other positions. But why is this important? And this is a figure that sends chills up and down me every time I see that number, because it's hard for me to fathom it. 1 billion children. There are 1 billion reasons to end violence, and that's not okay. 1 in 2 children under age 18 experienced violence in the past year. It's costly. It's costly for the children in terms of their development. It's costly for the countries in terms of what this means for them and what they're trying to achieve. And it's costly for the children in terms of as they become adults. There are consequences both during their childhood, immediate trauma, but also it can lead to child depression and behavioral problems. Poor mental health can influence a range of health outcomes, making young people more vulnerable to substance abuse and poor sexual health, poor educational achievement. We can go on and on and on. But it also has lifelong impacts. A 2012 study by Tofti et al. Found that school bullying perpetration significantly predicts the use of violence an average of 6 years later on in life. By the time a child reaches adulthood, she or he can be at an increased risk, not only of depression, but also post-traumatic stress disorder, and additional, but also of cardiovascular disease, asthma, obesity, diabetes, and numerous other illnesses that I'm sure Les could talk to us a lot about. Adults whose health and education have been compromised by childhood violence may also struggle with their employment later in life. I also talked about the economic costs. Andrew raised it this morning. The Overseas Development Institute had a paper that was commissioned at the time under Andrew's leadership when he was at Child Fund Alliance that looked at the global and economic impacts and costs resulting from the consequences of physical, psychological, and sexual violence against children. And it could be as high as $7 trillion US. This massive cost is higher than the investment required to prevent much of that violence. So how do we choose to spend our dollars? We also, as part of a number of agencies, including the partnership and UNICEF and our civil society colleagues, recently did a report called Counting Pennies. And this report looked at the official development assistance and what that means for violence against children. And it found that In 2015, official development assistance spending was $174 billion, and of that, less than 0.6% was allocated to ending violence against children. So we're not spending the money at the national level within our governments. I'm Canadian, but we're also not assisting within the other governments and other countries where we are. Prior to 2015, we had the Millennium Development Goals. They were targeted solely to developing countries. We also had a Rio process, which was looking more at the environment. The Sustainable Development Goals were designed to bring those together, to have a holistic response as a world to how we want to move forward for the next 15 years. The Millennium Development Goals did not include anything about child protection or violence against children. And that was a big loss for us, because what that meant was that in countries' overseas development assistance, they weren't putting money towards a target that wasn't there. In national budgets within developing countries, there wasn't money put towards ending violence against children. So that's why we worked really hard to make sure that within the next agenda and the next 15 years, there were going to be targets specifically to addressing violence against children. And this is a universal agenda. And it makes me really proud that it is, because it's also saying to the world, it's not us and you, it's for all of us. So whether you're a child in South Sudan, or a child in Sydney, or a child in Brooklyn or New York, you have these same rights as a child. But the Sustainable Development Goals also say you have the same, your government should be doing the same things to realize these targets for you. You'll see within here that gender equality has its own goals and targets. There was some discussion at some point whether the goal on gender equality and the target specifically within that if you look at 5.2 and 5.3, there was some discussion that during the negotiations whether we needed an additional target on violence against children. And Tracy, you'll be pleased to know the decision was yes. But that is a symbol of some of the conversations that take place in terms of making sure that when we're talking about gender, we recognize girls and boys and how it impacts them. But we also need targets that look specifically at violence against children. And that's what 16.2 does. So these are the targets within the Sustainable Development Goals that address violence against children. And as I said, it includes specific targets for women and girls, eliminating harmful practices. It includes 8.7, which looks at child labor and ending all forms of child labor by 2025, and the worst forms of child labor should be happening sooner. And it also looks at education. The Sustainable Development Goals also go on to look at how do we reduce the impact of violence in families, in communities, and in all settings. So it looks at all violence everywhere, access to safe, affordable, accessible, and sustainable transport systems, and universal access to safe, inclusive, accessible, green, and public spaces. And it's also about justice for all. The rule of law, legal identity for all, including birth registration, and strengthening relevant national institutions through international cooperation for building capacity at all levels, particularly in developing countries, to prevent violence and combat terrorism and crime. And to get us to this space, there was a lot of collaboration that happened between NGOs, within the UN system, amongst the governments, to ensure that the language was here, the language that we all wanted to see. And some may argue that having 17 goals and 169 targets makes this unachievable. I would argue that we needed to make sure that the targets were in there to address violence against children. And I think we should be proud of what's there now. This is a summary version of the strategy for the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. It took us a year to develop this strategy, and that's not lightning fast. But the reason it took that long was because it went out for consultation. Because we are a partnership, because we bring together all of those sectors that I spoke about, it took a year to get something that people were going to stand behind and want to be part of. We also have a youth-friendly version of the strategy. And we did consultations with children and young people in over 20 countries, over 1,600 young people, because they shouldn't be the afterthought. We needed to make sure that we were doing this with them from the get-go. Our mission is to make society safer for children and end violence against children everywhere. Our principles are pretty simple: to be rights-focused, child-centered, universal, gender-sensitive, inclusive, transparent, evidence-based, and results-oriented. And we have 3 goals: to build and sustain political will, to accelerate action, and to strengthen collaboration. And these are the 3 things that we think are going to be foundational to the success of ending violence as a partnership. And it's about all countries stepping up and saying they want to be part of this. It's about how do we accelerate action within those countries? Or as we like to say in the Secretariat, how do we get stuff done? And in accelerating action, we also have the Global Fund to End Violence Against Children. And that has its own targets about online exploitation against children, about ending violence with children where they live and in their communities or schools and their homes. And the third target of the fund is about children on the move, including children in crisis and conflict. In terms of strengthening collaboration, this is where we come together. This is where we are trying to get information from countries and also spread it out. We will be having our first Solutions Summit hosted by the Prime Minister of Sweden in February, where countries that have put up their hand to say they want to be part of this partnership will come together and start having those conversations, to start talking about what are the solutions that have worked for them, what are the solutions that have been a bit more challenging, and what's not working at all. And then we have drivers. And our drivers are movement building, finance and resources, data and evidence, and monitoring and evaluation. And we do always have a challenge. The sector is notoriously underfunded, and it, I think, continues to be underfunded. So that's why we have in there very clearly that that is one of our drivers, finances. Movement building, very much linked to what I'll be talking about in a little bit in terms of the social norms. How to create a movement, we can't do that sitting in New York. But what we'd love to be able to do is to be a helpful envoy that brings together the various campaigns and activities that are happening in other countries and bring them to the global level. There is a lot of really interesting work happening in this area. How do we all know about it? How do we all share experiences? I talked earlier about the evidence base. Inspire is the culmination of a number of UN agencies coming together and saying, we have our solutions. There's different solutions to ending violence that agencies are sharing. How do we bring this together as evidence-based and something that anybody can pick up and run with and modify to the context in which they're living? But I want to focus on the norms and values. Although violence against children is found worldwide, the reason that it persists may vary by culture, by community, and it's by understanding the norms that govern a society, we can provide clues to the underlying causes of such violence and how it can be prevented. Different social norms can help explain the widespread use of violence against children. In certain cultures, for example, violence may be perceived as normal and acceptable and a way to resolve conflict. Examining attitudes towards corporal punishment sheds light on cultural views regarding child rearing, and it also offers relevant insights for the development of strategies aimed at promoting positive parenting. But doing so requires modifying deeply ingrained social and societal cultural norms, including that some forms of violence are not only normal, but sometimes justifiable. How do we break that down? And examples of this include peers coercing young boys into gangs as a rite of passage, and girls and boys both not reporting violence because of fears of stigma and shame. And what Inspire attempts to do is provide effects of norms and value change on reducing violence against children. And what these potential effects include are the positive acceptance of violence against women and children. Reduced acceptance of violence against women and children. More favorable beliefs towards gender equity and gender equitable divisions of labor. More favorable attitudes to nonviolent approaches to parent discipline. Greater recognition of what constitutes abusive behavior towards intimate partners and children. Increased bystander interventions to prevent violence against children and intimate partners, as well as reduction in physical or sexual violence by parent or intimate partner. So I'm going to walk you through 2 case studies. One of them is about corporal punishment. In 1979, the government of Sweden prohibited corporal punishment. In 2011, there was a study that 92% of parents believe that corporal punishment in Sweden is wrong. 92%. And that there was also no evidence that they had replaced corporal punishment with another form of humiliating punishment. So there was more effort on positive parenting practices. So again, 1979, the law comes into place. In 1981, 2 years after that law was introduced, 90% of the families were aware of its existence because of a large-scale campaign. Pamphlets were given out to every family in Sweden that had a child, letting them know about the law and letting them know why it was important. Milk cartons had information about corporal punishment on them. Great way to use a milk carton. This is 1979 and 1981. Imagine what could happen today, and Felipe will give some current examples of how we can change perceptions, starting with laws, to end different forms of violence against children or all forms of violence against children. As of today, 52 states have prohibited all forms of corporal punishment of children within the family home. The second example I want to talk a little bit about is from the University of Kentucky. And it's their Green Dot program. And they have a green dot program and a red dot program. And they have a map. And when some violence happens, a red dot goes on the map of the campus. And when something good happens in terms of prevention, of students taking steps to prevent something happening to another student, a green dot goes on there. And they've been tracking the number of green dots and red dots. And it's a way of looking at how bystander interventions can prevent violence against children. And they found that interpersonal violence victimization rates were 17% lower amongst students attending the intervention relative to comparative campuses. Both male and female students attending colleges with a Green Dot program reported lower victimization. Males reported lower perpetration rates compared to colleges without the program. Green dots, red dots. It doesn't need to be complicated. If we want to have behavior change, we need to address social norms. We need to build a movement, and we need to sustain a movement. Andrew touched lightly on how fortunate you are in New South Wales and in Australia, because you live in a society that has the system set up to handle this in terms of a response. So if you go out there and you start increasing awareness that this is not okay, that children start to call in more, that children start to take action themselves in terms of reporting to police, in terms of asking for services, you have that capacity. And if you don't, find it. These are the countries that have initially expressed interest in pathfinding within the partnership. Hate to keep going back to Sweden, but Sweden was the first country to put its hand up in the air and say, we want to be part of this. And the reason they did was because of the increased number of unaccompanied children that were arriving into their country, and they were looking for support from other countries in terms of lessons learned and strategies for how they can make sure that those children are not getting lost and how they're accessing the services that they need and require. This is now outdated because South Africa just formally sent us a letter asking to be a pathfinder. There's a lot of requirements for pathfinding countries, which is why it takes about a year from the start of a conversation to when they join, because it's something we ask them to take seriously, because we're asking them to live up to the mission of the partnership and ending violence against children everywhere. It would be great to see Australia on there. It would also be great to see Canada. But hopefully one day we will get there. We bring together some of the various partners within the partnership, including the children and young people themselves, because we think it's a turning point. It is the time when change can happen. We now have 13 years left of these Sustainable Development Goals to make that happen. We also know what works to end violence. I also believe you have a copy of this within your brochure, within your packages. And these are some of the evidence base. And right now we're in the midst of developing implementation handbooks for each of these 7 strategies. Those are being developed in collaboration with NGOs. And one of the things that as NGOs we're asking for is that children's participation be central to those implementation handbooks, and that it not just be a child-friendly version of Inspire, because it's not just enough for children and young people to know what those evidence-based solutions are, but we need to make sure that their participation in terms of the implementation is foundational in how that works out. At the partnership, we believe that key actors coming together, everyone at the table, can have a successful resolution to this ending violence. And key to that is children's participation. We know we will not end violence against children without children, without listening and acting on what children say to us. And that was something that came out strongly this morning as well. Children's capacities evolve and change throughout the period of childhood. Their experience, their participation in and response to violence will vary according to their age. Their voices must be amplified, and their active age-appropriate engagement to prevent and report violence must be encouraged without compromising their safety and protection. We cannot and should not do this without their participation and without their partnership. And it's important for us to remember that millions of citizens around the world were consulted on what should be part of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the number one thing that children and young people around the world raised as what was missing from the MDGs was child protection and ending violence against children. So it's time for us to act, and it's time for us to start changing those norms, to start changing those attitudes that make it okay for this to happen. And there's 2 things, well, there's many things I heard in the consultation this morning, But there's two things I wanted to leave you with that came out of the young people this morning. One, there is no peace. And two, it can wreck your childhood. 1 billion children should not have to go through that. Thank you.